So much, Professor Dr. Sharifa Alatas, for your fascinating presentation and for shedding light on this very important topic from your own perspective, which is also, I would say, challenging the prevailing narrative and the prevailing dominant discourse, both within academic community and also the think tank community, and particularly the press. It is very interesting that you noted that the Asean countries should be given voice, or they should be more proactive in trying to present their own views rather than being a object of international politics and the conflict of two global powers. Let me now, ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, let me now start the discussion with our speakers. So we've concluded this first part of this webinar, and now we will continue with the discussions. You can ask questions. You have a chat section, so you can place your questions in the chat. You can put your name down, or you don't have to. It's up to you. We already have some questions that have arrived, and if I may ask Professor Chandra Muzaffar, because the question is directed to him, but both speakers can comment. Please feel free to comment. Adriana is asking Dr. Chandra, a question is related, I'll just shorten it a little bit. The Uyghur issue is the question. The Uyghur issue is not real. Is that what Professor Chandra meant? The Chinese have a long history with Islam, Professor Chandra mentioned, but Uyghurs have been treated as such for a few decades. So the reports that the Uyghur community members are being put into camps and being stripped of their minority identity is a sham. The question goes. Some of these reports come from Uyghurs themselves, and in addition, the Chinese movement to establish the hold in the world, for example, in Africa. So this is the second part of the questions. What do you think about the Chinese influence in African countries and the Chinese involvement in this continent? And we have also seen some effects of it in Malaysia in relation to previous agreements that the previous government signed with the Chinese authorities in relation to infrastructure developmental projects. So, Professor Chandra, would you be able to address these two questions? So it's an Uyghur issue, and the second one is the involvement of China in African continent, and also the third part of the question is the Chinese involvement in infrastructural development in Malaysia as well.
Brother Osman, I think there are three questions actually that one has to respond to, and try to be brief.
Please.
Yes. Now, the first one about the Uyghur thing. I had said that it was exaggerated, it was distorted. I'm not saying that problems don't exist. There will be some problems that have to be addressed. I would argue, for instance, that in the course of trying to check terrorism, and it is true that there were Uyghurs, both the actual fighters and their families that went to Syria, for instance, and, they've been part of that chain for quite a while. In the course of addressing this challenge, the authorities, the Chinese authorities, both in Beijing and in Xinjiang, they may have taken measures which were perhaps a little too extreme. The authorities, they could have done it in a different way. It's quite possible. But at the same time, one must recognize that there are larger issues at stake. The attempt to demonize China is clearly obvious as far as this issue is concerned. And if you look at the place where the Uyghurs come from, it is of tremendous strategic value. And this is why I think there is an attempt to sort of give the impression that the Uyghurs are being persecuted and all the rest of it, because people know that both in terms of its mineral wealth, in terms of its location, you know, Xinjiang province is a neighbor to 8 Muslim majority countries. And if you look at the One Belt, One Road venture, the majority of the countries in that part of the world that are part of that venture are Muslim majority countries. And Muslim countries play a very big role in the One Belt, One Road enterprise, because historically that's what it was. Muslim countries were very important as part of the Silk Road, you know. And now this is an attempt to strengthen them, to revive them. And I think people know what the potential is. And this is the reason why I think they decided to focus on Xinjiang and use Xinjiang as a sort of target for this attempt to separate, to create a schism, clear dichotomy between China and the Muslims. And a number of Muslim countries have taken the bait, it's true. But there are a number of others that have refused to take the bait. They have been there, they've sent the ambassadors, journalists have gone there, and they've come up with reports that are quite different. And you'll find that many of these so-called Uyghurs who are making these statements are Uyghurs who live in the United States, America, or Australia. And they receive protection from these countries, and they're part of that network, the network that seeks to demonize China. You know their backgrounds, you know what they have been doing and all the rest of it. So I'm not convinced that the stories that they put out and the stories which the Western media puts out, whether these stories should be given any credence or not, as far as I'm concerned, I would look at these stories with an objective perspective, knowing full well that this is part of a much bigger game linked to strategic relations, the One Belt, One Road policy, and of course, to the way in which the question of terrorism is dealt with in China and in other places. Just common sense, Brother Osman, if you think about this. Is it in the interests of a country like China to antagonize millions of Muslims? Doesn't make sense. Why would they want to do it? You look at their relationship in different parts of the world. They have to deal with Muslim countries. They are dependent upon Muslim countries for oil. Saudi Arabia, Iran, all of them are close to China, partly because of a very commercial reason. It is oil. And the Chinese know that oil is fundamental to their transformation of the economy. They're not going to antagonize these countries by doing a thing like this. And if you look at, again, the whole history and background and so on, it's very obvious to us. And this is something, it's part of a larger point that I want to make, that the Chinese, historically speaking, and I repeat this, I've repeated this many times before, historically speaking, the Chinese have been far more responsible in the way in which they have used their power than many other big powers and global powers. Don't forget that even up to the 18th century, the country that had the biggest GDP in the world was actually China. People are not aware of this. 23% of the world's GDP was from China. And if you look at China historically, they have been very, very important, but they've never sought to dominate and control. When I tell people the Chinese borders of today are the Chinese borders that have existed since 200 BC. There's been no change as far as those borders are concerned. When I tell people that China's border disputes with so many countries, they've been resolved through peaceful negotiations compared to many other countries. And I think these are things that show that the Chinese have a certain way of dealing with these issues. They've never sought to be a hegemonic power. The Chinese constitution and the constitution of the Chinese Communist Party, they say clearly that they will not seek to be hegemonic. And if such a thing happens, they hope, as Chinese leaders have said, like the late Zhou Enlai, that the Chinese people will join up with people from other parts of the world and overthrow such a government. So hegemony is not part of the agenda. And again, look at things objectively. Compared to every other country, including a small Western country like Spain or Portugal, you look at the rise of these powers, Spain and Portugal, for instance, in the 16th century, compared to China's rise. In the case of Spain and Portugal, there's so much bloodshed, so much killing, mass killings. Look at China. Its rise has generally been peaceful. It doesn't go around conquering other people's lands, massacring them, and all the rest of it. So let's give credit where it is due. But at the same time, I would say, be realistic. The Chinese, in their desire to play a role in the world, they may do things which we must be prepared for. They may exert their authority in a certain way, and it may not be good for others, perhaps. We don't know. Be realistic, but at the same time, be honest about history, about the evolution of history and the role of China in the past and in the present. Now, the question about Africa, that is the related question. Again, look at the evidence. Look at what the Africans themselves have said about China's role. Generally, the image that China has among African countries is far more positive than the image that Western countries have in Africa. And this is a fact. Because as some African leaders had once said, and it's people like the leader of Kenya, the leader of Ethiopia and others, they have said this openly, that the Chinese have not exploited us the way in which we were exploited during the colonial period. There have been some problems here and there in terms of bilateral ties, but by and large, if there are issues, they've been resolved through negotiations and all the rest of it. But this attempt to exploit, to go on a rampage and take over resources and give nothing in return, they've not done that. Don't forget that even during the Mao period, the Chinese were involved in infrastructure development in Africa. In East Africa, in Central Africa, they were involved in infrastructure development. And today it is much more extensive. And many of these countries, the economies have changed for the better as a result of this sort of development. I have written about this, sole question of China and Africa. And there are African friends who have said that it is a reflection of what has really happened. So this antagonism that people talk about, how the Africans are angry with China and all that, is much more a figment of the Western imagination. And this thing about Malaysia, now if you look at the ECRL, for instance, that is the East Coast Rail Project, yes, it was renegotiated, it was overpriced, there were suggestions of corruption, and there are people who will tell you that this was due more to the Malaysian side than to China. In other words, the Malaysians were involved in the process, as we have now discovered. They were the ones who had done things that were wrong, and we can't go and blame the Chinese for that. It was our shortcoming. It was our mistake, what we did, and there was an attempt to correct that. And I hope that we would be careful when we negotiate projects, not just with the Chinese, with anyone else. In other words, we have to be honest and we have to make sure that we don't try to cheat ourselves and cheat other people. Okay.
So Chandra, If I can direct this next question to Professor Alatas, and it's related to, it's sent by Weng San Lao, and it's related to the question of values, value systems, the difference of value systems, difference of governance, the types of governance, universal values, basic human rights, personal liberties, democratic way of living, versus the autocratic ways of running the government and society. And the question mentions Tibet, again, Uyghur issue, and the Hong Kong question as well. So does it mean that the COVID-19 situation exacerbated the relations between US and China, and it also claims that not only the United States but many other countries are expressing their disapproval of how the PRC handling both domestic and international affairs. And the question concludes with, do you agree with this, Professor Alatas?
Okay. Well, there's a lot of permutations to that question. Basically, what I can say is that the COVID-19 pandemic happened to take place or happened to erupt during an American general election year. It also happens to be the right moment to start another narrative to divert attention away from the mishandling of certain domestic issues within the US. So on the one hand, I would say that COVID-19, the situation has exposed a lot of problems within the US domestic situation. At the same time, it also has allowed civil societies throughout the rest of the world to react to many conditions that were already within their societies pre-COVID-19. I'm not really sure what the question about civil liberties is about, or universal values. It wasn't clear when you were mentioning that, but I presume that the person asking the question would like to know if China has violated civil liberties, or is the US responsible to save Hong Kong? I'm not sure about where the direction of the question is going. Can you please help me?
I think the question, the way I read it, is related to the values, differences in values between the United States and China, and how they approach to this issue of human rights and personal liberties.
All right. My stand, or my opinion about US attitude towards human rights is just as good or bad as the attitude that China may have towards human rights. Everything the US says that they are trying to save the downtrodden from, and therefore they send in their military to save an oppressed people, to me is not an exercise of human rights. It is interfering in the internal affairs of other countries, resulting in masses of local people being killed in a war that they shouldn't be involved in. Many of these wars were taking place in the Middle East, and they have exited those countries. We know what those countries are. They've left Iraq, Syria, many other countries in the Middle East in a terrible state. Now, to me, that is not promoting humanitarian or civil liberties for the countries involved. So interfering in another country's wars or internal affairs is not an exercise, or is not a right that the US should take upon themselves. Similarly, if China does such a thing, why is there a global outcry against that? Hong Kong being a good example. So I'm not excusing China, but what I am saying is redirect the question and the narrative to the US as well. Let's not be skewed in our judgment of human rights or civil liberties. Let's be fair when we judge and when we accuse one country. Let's be fair, and the facts are all there. So let's change the narrative to include both. That would be my answer.
And this is a very, in recent months or a year has been very prominent. Can China rise peacefully? There was a lot of discussions, particularly by the realist theoreticians such as Professor John Mearsheimer, who is claiming that China cannot rise peacefully. What do you think?
If we go on the basis, Brother Osman, of the evidence before us, and the evidence is both historical and contemporary. If you look at China's rise in the past, when it played an important role in the world, it was peaceful. There is a very well-known story of the famous Chinese admiral, Cheng Ho, when he was in Java as part of his 7 voyages around the world. He was asked to settle a dispute between 2 warring factions, 2 princes, and it was over a piece of territory. And one of them told Cheng He that if he takes his side, provides military support to him, he would give him half of the territory. And Cheng He turned it down. And he said that we are not involved in disputes of this sort, and we don't want anyone's territory. And it's true that in spite of his voyages, he didn't conquer other territories, neither did he annex any territory. His missions were largely peaceful. It was trade-based. It was also based in terms of the needs of diplomacy and all the rest of it. And I think that's how the Chinese had been. There were long periods when the Chinese just withdrew from the world, as you know, and there were times when they were involved. When they were involved, the record generally is a record which those of us who are committed to peace and understanding, we would say that the Chinese played a positive role. And if you look at the current situation, you'll find that one of the long-standing disputes that China has in terms of territory is with India. Now again, if you look at India and China, and I'm sure there are people who would know this well. If you look at India and China, India has had border disputes with 6 other countries. Not one of them has been solved. China had border disputes for quite a long while with 13 countries, 13 countries. The only one that they have not solved is the one with India. So you see the difference between these 2 big powers, that the Chinese have been more inclined towards settling disputes, while in the case of India, and especially if you look at what has happened recently, the US hand is quite clear in trying to instigate the Indians to do certain things and then say, look, oh, it is not us, it's the other side. And unfortunately, India has taken the bait, partly because I think of its own desire for power and its own attitude towards China's role, which is why, India did not back the One Belt, One Road enterprise, even though it was in her interest. And also, I think because of China's close relationship with Pakistan, India has reacted in a certain way. So India and China, they offer a contrast as far as this is concerned. And I would say that it is perhaps easier to deal with China. We're talking small nations. Easier to deal with China because the record speaks for itself.
Yes, I will add, we can let's ask that question, or rather, let me answer that question with another question. If we ask the question, can China rise peacefully? The question I would ask is, has America risen peacefully? And America is at the helm, declining nevertheless, but has been at the helm of global hegemony, but has left a trail of devastation behind it. A lot of this devastation has been concentrated in the developing world, in the global south. So let's not, as I mentioned before, let's not keep judging China's rise without looking back at the US as a rising power. What has been happening over the decades since 1945, since the end of World War II. So, and as Dr. Chandra has said, it's easier for countries in the global south to deal with China than it has been for us dealing with the US. Many countries in the Middle East, in South America, in Africa, can attest to that. So that would be my answer, that I would say China's rise is a lot more peaceful in comparison to what has been the defining factor for US rise.
But Professor Mearsheimer claims that the United States as a predominant global power will not allow China to rise peacefully. What does that mean for Southeast Asia? I think it's a huge predicament. What is your take on that?
Well, if that's his realist opinion about China not being allowed or not being permitted to rise peacefully, it doesn't mean that China doesn't want to rise peacefully. If you notice the slight difference in the narrative, the discourse is about not allowing China to rise, as opposed to China's intention to rise peacefully. The investments that the BRI has allowed countries to involve themselves in through the investment, the AIIB, this is an economic, peaceful way of consolidating your hegemony worldwide. Yes, no doubt about that. The Chinese want control in terms of economic and technological power. But it is a far cry from dropping bombs on countries, which the US is very much used to doing. So Mearsheimer may have his opinion, but I disagree with that.
Thank you, Professor Alatas. The next question is in relation to the China exporting. It says China is surely not exporting socialism and not interested in conquering the world via socialism or communism, but the PRC hopes to dominate by exporting corruption via government contracts. Are there any truth in this to both speakers?
If I can step in first, again, the question implies the passive attitude or passive behavior of the receiving country. Why is it necessary that the country who deals with China will be arm twisted into accepting corrupt deals? The corruption goes both ways. Countries who want to deal with China will have to discuss with China on equal terms. If both want to be corrupt and participate in corrupt practices, so be it. But why blame China for that? The point is, this transaction has to be negotiated. And if countries subscribe to corrupt practices or accept the corruption that China offers, it is their doing. We don't blame China for that. For instance, the ECRL, the problem that Malaysia has had with China. I'm not going to say our government, the previous government is free of their own nefarious, corrupt thinking about it. Why do we should not be ever ready to just blame China 100% for these transactions that may have gone wrong, or these investments that may have gone wrong?
Thank you, Professor Alatas. Professor Chandra, would you like to add anything to this question? Does China export corruption to the rest of the world?
It's a loaded question. It's a biased question. China has dealt with other countries like many other countries have. If you look at, say, different countries, different systems, East and West, the way they've dealt with Myanmar, you'll find that there are countries that have indulged in wrongdoings, and it's sometimes in their interests, in the interest of the companies that they sponsor, and sometimes it's in the interest of the host country, which may be indulging in these practices. As a rule, I think we should ensure that international trade and exchanges should be free of corruption. That should be our commitment. And it has to be global, just like, in the last few years, the United Nations has played a more active role in the eradication of global corruption. And I think that should be strengthened. It doesn't matter which countries are involved. And I don't think any country should present itself as holier than the others, that they have not been involved in. The United States record in terms of corruption, the record of other countries, it is something that one should condemn. Just as if the Chinese have been doing this, it should be condemned also. And we should work towards a world order where corruption is not part of economic deals or other forms of deals. And it is possible, because I think the mechanisms are there. And even in terms of law, it's a question of both international law and making effective changes to domestic law in order to fight this. That should be our approach. Instead of just saying, oh, look at the way the Chinese export corruption without even basis or without providing strong evidence, we just make wild, reckless statements of this sort, which is the common practice. It's part of the demonization that both Sharifa Munira and I are concerned about, and many others are concerned about. We are not for this country or that country. We just don't want this type of perspective on nation states, on practices, on individuals. This is what we are against. Let's be fair, let's be honest, let's be objective.
Just another question for you, Professor Muzaffar. It's related to militarization of South China Sea by establishing military installations unilaterally. Does that, in your view, create tensions between Philippines and China? That's how the question is worded, but would you have something to say about it?
Yeah, I think there are tensions. The tensions have been there for quite a while. What brought these issues to the fore were two trends in relation to the Philippines and China. Number one, the change of government in the Philippines in 2016, when Duterte came to power. Duterte, maverick as he is, I think what he has chosen to do is to revisit the Philippines' relationship with the United States. He has asked questions which others did not ask before him about the United States and its role. I mean, like those questions pertaining to the visit of American ships and so on. Of course, the bases were banned after the Aquino episode, but nonetheless, military relationships have continued. And quite a few Philippine activists and even some legislators have been very concerned about this. And Duterte, I think, gave expression to that concern. He wanted some of these things revisited, and the Americans didn't like it. And therefore, this became a very big issue because of the change in leadership. And I think the other factor was, of course, China itself had become much more active in the region. And that includes, of course, the Philippines. It has got some issues, maritime issues, with the Philippines and with some of the other countries. Now, if I may make this point, which I should have earlier, but I've done this before, I think the Chinese stance on the South China Sea, that something like 85% of the entire South China Sea is China's. This is the position that has been associated with them, what is known as the 9-dash line. You know, this notion that some sort of mapping that took place, it was accepted by some countries way back in the 1930s. It was not even the communist government, you know, at that time, that this should be the basis, the 9-dash line thing, the basis for China's claims. I personally do not buy that. I think it is a very weak argument. I think the law of the seas should prevail, if you ask me, but implemented in a just manner. But the law of the seas provides the right framework as far as maritime relations go in this part of the world. And the Chinese, I think, should accept this, that their claim to 85% of the whole region, which impinges upon Malaysia's territorial rights, you know, it impinges upon nearly every other country's territorial rights. I think that's something which is not sustainable. And yes, here again, if the ASEAN countries speak as one, if they get together, consolidate their position and say, this is our stand. Unfortunately, ASEAN states are divided, as every ASEAN summit has shown, on this issue. If they were not divided, then I think their voice would carry much greater weight. We have to tell China that this is unacceptable. This claim, 85% is unacceptable. So I see the Philippines, that issue within that context. And once the Chinese told us that this is the message, then I think China will have to begin to relook at its relations with Vietnam, with the Philippines, with Malaysia, with Brunei. These are countries that have tangible issues as far as maritime rights, and we have to resolve it. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why the Code of Conduct is having a rough passage, because this issue has not been resolved. It has to be resolved.
Professor Chandra, our next question is related to Monroe Doctrine. You mentioned Monroe Doctrine, but Professor Alatas, if you can also comment on this. What if the US had its own Monroe Doctrine, which Professor Chandra mentioned earlier in his presentation, why not China have her own Monroe Doctrine for its own region?
I think some people may be situating or creating that situation within the South China Sea region itself, that China wants this to be their backyard. As was said earlier, the possibility is there because ASEAN isn't united yet in how to deal with a rising China. Nevertheless, the situation is not bleak. It is only bleak, in my opinion, because of the creation or the idea of the Indo-Pacific that has emerged recently in 2007 and then recently again in 2017. The idea of the Indo-Pacific and the Asian NATO idea. These concepts are provocative and provoking China into creating more of a sphere of influence in the region. And this is where ASEAN is sandwiched between these antagonisms. So again, China is not single-handedly desirous of creating this sphere of influence. They are pushed into it by opposing forces, which are provoking the behavior, subjecting ASEAN to this. For me, it is unnecessary that the Indo-Pacific concept emerged. Unnecessary that the Quad has been created. And it's unnecessary to drive this narrative of an Asian NATO. Again, it is all militaristic in nature, as opposed to what ASEAN's approach is, which is security, but non-militaristic security. So the situation is precarious, but again, it depends on the agency of ASEAN, whether they can solve, whether we can solve our internal conflicts. For instance, Malaysia and the Philippines recently have a problem because of what was uttered by the Philippines about Sabah. So we have our own internal disputes, but it is spilling out into the major regional spark that is also being, the Indo-Pacific and the Quad powers are just waiting for something to happen. So that's my take on China's sphere of influence.
Well, just to reinforce what Dr. Mira has said, well, we must remember that the Monroe Doctrine, 1823, was enunciated during the era of colonial dominance. It was part of that period in history where one was carving out colonial spheres of influence. And what the US did was wrong. Just as those who were part of the Berlin Conference and what they did to Africa was wrong. Likewise, I think if China wants to do something like that today, given his own rise, I think it would be wrong. I would be against the idea of a sphere of influence based upon the logic of the Monroe Doctrine. It will not be in anyone's interests, certainly not the interests of the nations in this part of the world. And I don't think the Chinese are thinking of something similar to the Monroe Doctrine. There's no evidence at all to suggest this. And if the Chinese have been reacting to certain things, including the pivot to Asia, and, Asian NATO and all the rest of it, it's because someone else is pushing a particular agenda. And the Chinese have been responding, reacting to this. But I think this is where China, which has shown quite a great deal of restraint and maturity, by and large, one hopes that they'll continue to exercise that restraint rather than react to some of these provocations. Even in this recent spate of differences, disputes, and so on between China and the United States of America, any objective analyst would draw this conclusion that the Chinese have been quite restrained. You close our consulate in Texas, we close your consulate in Chengdu. That's been the approach. But on their own, they don't want to provoke a situation. And I don't think the Chinese are interested in provoking a war with the United States. It's not in their interests. It's just being very, very practical. Because for China, I think it is its emergence as an important nation, economically strong, able to look after its people. That is its primary consideration, meaning by which getting rid of poverty. There's still a lot of poverty in China. And overcoming the disparities between the urban and semi-urban rural areas and so on. I think these are its priorities. And it knows that a war will impede its pursuit of these goals. So I don't think the Chinese are interested in going to war. The United States of America, at this moment, I think it's not interested in a war either. It's in no position to go to a war. It's, as I said earlier on, it's a broken nation. And if certain things are done, it's partly because I suppose someone is pursuing his own political agenda, or it's because of the way in which various forces are at each other's throat in the United States of America. But I don't think the US would want to see a global war. It's not in its interest.
Professor Chandra, within the last few days in Malaysia, in some media, there was discussion. There were a few articles written by, I think, Mr. Rais Hussein from the Emir think tank. And he mentioned, he wrote 2 articles, which it's quite interesting. He mentioned the Thucydides trap, the risk of war, which also, I think, Graham Allison, the US former policymaker and diplomat and professor, also Professor Kishore Mahbubani mentioned that often there is a risk of this from happening. So what do you think on this? Even though the US doesn't want, or maybe is not capable of waging war, but there is always a risk of accidental conflict emerging.
Thanks, brother. The risk is there, but as I said, there are other factors at play at this moment, including what we have just talked about, the Chinese, the way in which they are focused on certain goals, a certain mission. They've been provoked, no end, over the last few months, but they have restrained themselves. And I think that is a pattern that we will see for a while. I don't think they'll want to go to war. And in the case of the United States, they're not in a position to go to war. So I don't see this happening. The Thucydides trap that many people have talked about, Well, if you look at Sparta and Athens historically, you can understand why it happened, given the situation. One is not justifying the war between these two, but I think the situation today, and even if you compare it to 1914, Germany and Britain, which is a comparison people have made sometimes when they talk of the Thucydides trap, I don't think the situation is comparable. It's not comparable. We have a declining global power, and the decline is much more serious than what is made out to be, largely because the media is in the hands of the declining global power, and there are many forces that are part of that declining power, and they do not want the truth to be known. They would like to keep this image alive. They would like to keep up the pretenses, as it were, about the US power and all the rest of it. But it is a declining power, and that will constrain it from doing various things. And I think for the US, it was quite a big shock when Chinese missiles, very sophisticated missiles, the range of 4,000 kilometers and so on. This was, of course, as you know, it was something that happened recently. It was non-combat. It was just a demonstration. The Chinese showed that they could bring down missiles of that sort. And I think that's the reason why the US, they would be restrained in trying anything of that sort. And the Chinese have got a very sophisticated system for detecting navigational movements, which makes it better prepared for any confrontation in the South China Sea.
Thank you, Professor Chandra. Professor Alatas, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I would like to actually say that rather than the Thucydides trap, I think what we should be more afraid of is the Clausewitz trap. Basically, the way I see it, the real danger is the realization that the Americans have that they are a declining power. And with the kind of leadership the US has currently, because they know they are in decline, that spurt of egoism could translate into a massive onslaught against China and against a rising power. Whether it's rational or not is secondary. I think the Clausewitz trap I'm talking about is this idea of not wanting to lose face, a power in decline, being in ascendancy for the last 70 odd years, and being challenged by the yellow peril. amidst all this anti-Chinese, this racist, white supremacist attitude that has erupted all over the globe, I think this is the real danger. So we have to watch out for that, actually. And again, it's instigated by the US, by the West, against a rising power, which is China. So I wouldn't write off the possibility of something more than a Thucydides trap. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Alatas. Just a follow-up question, maybe if you can stay and answer it if you can. The question goes, we should be very careful of replacing one colonial power with another, meaning China. Do you think there is that risk?
Again, I will just answer this briefly. There is an assumption and a sweeping statement that China has the potential to be a colonizing power. I think as Dr. Chandra has mentioned previously, China's behavior has not been akin to a colonial power. So I do not see the relationship there between China's ascendancy and it becoming a colonial power. There are a lot of ramifications about how powers become dominant in a global situation without necessarily being a colonist, a colonializing power. So the question is rather ambiguous in my opinion. And I don't see China's ascendancy as a decline into colonialism again.
Professor Alatas, you mentioned earlier about the Indo-Pacific community or Indo-Pacific strategy. Also, Malaysian media have been recently published information about different countries having different strategies related to Indo-Pacific, both the United States, Japan, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe came up with this doctrine first, and then the US Defense Department documents, also Australian Defense, I think white paper talks about Indo-Pacific strategy. What do you think, what is your take on Indo-Pacific? Is it a politicized discourse, or is it, in the past, we know that for a few decades, the United States and its allies were referring to the region as a Asia-Pacific, even APEC, the very important multilateral organization is named after the Pacific, Asia-Pacific region. Suddenly, they came up with Indo-Pacific discourse, and this is taking hold, it seems.
I think I mentioned earlier that this is part of the control of a narrative, the control of how we imagine a situation. So Indo-Pacific clearly excludes China. It is a containment strategy to clearly tell China that we are a bunch of middle powers helmed by the US. We want to keep you out because you are dangerous. We need to then get our sphere of our security sphere in order and attract other smaller powers. We call it the Indo-Pacific, and you're not included. So it sounds like an academic exercise, but now the talk about an Asian NATO, it's still in its academic stage, but nevertheless, this is a build-up towards more provocation, and who knows the kind of retaliation that it's gonna create. So the possibility is that it could escalate, but I think, as Dr. Chandra has mentioned earlier, China knows and is responsible enough to know that a major war in the region is not in the interest for itself, or either the US for that matter. Even the Europeans do not want a major war in Southeast Asia. We are a region that is home to the most important waterways. A major war in this region would put a stop to massive transportation of goods, of raw material. It would be disruptive. So at this stage, Indo-Pacific, Asian NATO, it's very academic, but nevertheless, we should not ignore it, and we should not speak against it. We should not speak against it, and we should not refrain from saying that these are narratives aimed specifically to contain China, and it is counterproductive.
And it seems, Professor Alatas, at the moment that this Indo-Pacific doctrine is put forward by a Quad, as you mentioned, the Japan, Australia, India, and the United States. Where is ASEAN in this? Is there a unified response by ASEAN countries on the Indo-Pacific community and its future, and what it could mean for the region?
Well, there is no unified response per se, which is formal, but there is a formal response that ASEAN has come up with in 2019. They came up with a document which counters the American Freedom of Navigation document, or the free and independent navigation in the South China Sea. It is the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And this document is a list of provisions on how to manage navigation in the region, spearheaded by Indonesia, which is the largest country in the regional grouping. Indonesia clearly does not want either power, China nor the Quad, to interfere in its sphere of influence. ASEAN has an understanding with China. Individual ASEAN countries have an understanding with China that they deal with their specific problems relating to navigation on a bilateral matter, on a bilateral basis with China. They do not have a group security agreement, whereas they do have agreements as a group as it relates to economic issues. So the ASEAN, the AOIP, the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which is the document that came out last year, I think is a good enough retaliation. Retaliation is a strong word, but it is a good enough response to the American or the the Quad document. And this is what I meant by when I mentioned earlier in my talk about ASEAN owning their agency in how to navigate the issue, the problem in this part of the world. We are not yet confident enough. But part of the reason is because we are buffeted by all the different narratives that keep infringing upon our outlook on the region. And as I said, the responses by our think tanks, by our foreign minister, by our defense minister, by our academicians, we have to take a different sort of response than what we have been doing.
Thank you, Professor Alatas. Just one question related to Malaysia. The Auditor General's Department of Malaysia mentioned in its report that's from 2016 and 2019, there have been 89 times incursions by the Chinese naval vessels and the illegal flotilla of fishermen encroaching into Malaysian exclusive economic zones, 89 times. And this happened during two administrations Prime Minister Razak and Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad. Does that worry Malaysia? And what should Malaysia do about it?
Well, these problems happen year after year, decade after decade. We in ASEAN, not just Malaysia, lives with the problem. Yes, we worry about it, but we are not worried to the extent that it will blow up into a major regional conflict where Quad powers have to step in and save the day. I'm very particular about handling ASEAN problems the ASEAN way. Yes, ASEAN has been accused of being a talk shop. We achieve nothing because all we do is engage in diplomatic talk. But look at the other side of the coin. All this talk has resulted in no major war with China. We have problems with China. I am not unrealistic there. We definitely do have problems. Every ASEAN nation has a problem with China, but it doesn't mean that we need the Quad to come in and help solve it, because what has been working so far, we have managed. And we will continue to do so. The problem will not go away, but I think we are managing very well and we could improve, but it doesn't mean we need the Quad to save the day.
Thank you, Professor Alatas. In Australia, having lived in Australia for 20 years or so and studied there, I follow the situation in Australian political spectrum about, particularly in relation to China and Southeast Asia. And one of the scholars, Professor Rory Medcalf from the Australian National University, is talking about the Indo-Pacific. He's written a book about China's future and why China will not, I think it goes like that, map the world. He is very prominent, and he argues that the Indo-Pacific community has a role to play. Also, another scholar who is also a strategic scholar, Hugh White, argues that the Australia and Southeast Asian powers should share power with China. So there is no unified stand or agreement within the strategic community, even in Australia, which is a member of Quad. Do you think there is a room for discussions with Quad and ASEAN how to deal with China, or maybe there is?
I think the strategy ASEAN has taken so far, which is having security relations with many different powers in the region. This is a more, it is an approach which is compromising. It's a compromising approach in the sense that we don't take sides, but we are also aware that we do need to have decent security relations with different countries on a bilateral basis. We are not involved in security blocks, relations between security blocks, but we do have relationships between individual countries in the region, including Australia. We have the 5-power defense agreement. We have many different security relations going on. So we are not unrealistic in that sense, that we're not shutting out the rest of the world and dealing on a diplomatic basis only, dealing with China on a diplomatic basis only. But you're right, it is true, we do not have, there is no standard strategy insofar as how to deal with China in the Indo-Pacific yet. But my opinion is the provocative attitude or strategy that is helmed by the US is not the way to go. And China, as well as many countries in Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, which is a large voice in ASEAN, do not agree with the provocation that the Quad is projecting.
Thank you, Professor Alatas. If I can just ask one more last question, Professor Chandra Muzaffar, if I can ask you, your colleague, academic colleague, and Singaporean renowned diplomat and the former functionary of the United Nations, Kishore Mahbubani, is saying that the United States dominated world order or Western dominated world order led by the United States may well be just an aberration, that in the past, before 200 years, that India and China basically dominated the world, or what was known of the world at that time. Do you think this is right, Professor Chandra? Was the US dominated world order an aberration, as Professor Mahbubani argued?
It depends on what one's time span is before you decide whether it was an aberration or not. If you look at perhaps the last 200 years, it was real, Western dominance, and the consequences have been immense. And Western colonialism, unlike every other type of dominance in history, has had far-reaching implications in terms of changing the outlook of whole societies, its legal structure, its political structure, economics, everything that you can think of. So I don't see Western colonialism as an aberration. If it is a way of sort of trying to locate that period in history within a larger framework, it has had a far-reaching impact, and I'm glad it's coming to an end. This is part of that period that the famous Indian historian K.M. Panikar described as the Vasco da Gama epoch of history. But it is more than Vasco da Gama. It is Vasco da Gama, this part of the world, and Columbus, the other part of the world. But you had these two epochs in history, and the impact has been huge. We have to recognize that. And at the same time, I think it's wrong to see this so-called period of Chinese and Indian dominance simply because of the GDPs as a period of dominance in the same way as you see the West's dominance. They were totally different. If you look at China's role prior 18th century, where was the dominance? China was a major player, yes, 23% of the global GDP, India 21% of the global GDP. But both these countries, they didn't dominate the world. They did not dominate the world. They didn't have that military infrastructure, and they did not conquer lands and establish their rule and enslave people and all the rest of it. So I don't think it is fair to see those phases in history as dominance. It's not fair. Neither should one see that Western period as an aberration, because its impact is so great. It's not just an aberration. When you say that something is an aberration, it is something that had happened, not very significant, but something that was a little out of the ordinary. Of course, the nature of Western dominance was extraordinary in many ways, but nonetheless, I think the impact was far-reaching, and we have to keep that in mind. So I think we have to get our perspectives right on this question.
Thank you so much, Professor Chandra Muzaffar. On that note, we will have to conclude today's webinar. So I would like again to thank both of you, Professor Dr. Sharifa Munira Alatas and Professor Chandra Muzaffar, on your extraordinary presentations and discussions. You have given us a very, very important, and I'd say much needed perspective on how to understand the current tensions between the United States and China in particular, and also how it may affect the entire region. On behalf of the Islamic Renaissance Front, its director, Mr. Azrul, and also the founding director, Dr. Farooq Musa, I sincerely thank you so much for taking your precious time from your weekend to participate in IRF's webinar. So we very much appreciate that. And also thank you to all of the participants and the viewers. And hopefully we will be able to continue our discussion some other time, because the issue will not go away and will continue. We hope that the tensions will be resolved peacefully. Thank you so much once again, and have a good afternoon, and Assalamu alaikum. Thank you.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you.